But one morning, through the mists of the clearing fog, a well-armed soldier on horseback suddenly appeared. They hadn't seen him arrive and wondered who he was, and whether by chance he was an outpost of a larger armed contingent attempting a sortie. No one spoke anymore, but everyone tried hard to mask the sudden situation. The women went out and began to do impossible jobs, while the men took refuge in the cellar, from where they had built a tunnel that led far away, into the woods behind the farm. But that night had arrived without being seen, and it was strange. How did he know the shortcuts that only the locals could know? He watched the farm, but didn't advance, and no one on the farm had the courage to call him. Everyone looked at each other without saying a word, and everyone stared at the strange night. Thomas, the old father, took courage and went out onto the porch, accompanied by Mary, his wife, and from there, they observed the strange night better. Then Mary suddenly took courage and called him by name. "Elvin, is that you?" Elvin remembered that sweet voice that he had always dreamed of hearing again, and with a leap he dismounted from his horse and knelt in the snow. Mom, it's me," he said, taking off his armor and throwing away his sword. "Mom, forgive me, I'm back." He stood up and ran to his mother, who was reaching him. He hugged her and kissed her. They fell into the snow but didn't let go. Thomas was stunned and overwhelmed with emotion. His Elvin had returned. He fell to his knees and thanked God the Father for the enormous gift he had given him, and cried with joy and emotion. In an instant, all the women stopped pretending to work and ran towards them. They stood up, and Elvin ran to his father. He helped him up and hugged him, telling him how much he had missed him during all those years spent in the Holy Land. He asked his beloved parents for forgiveness. Shortly after, his brothers and brothers-in-law arrived. He asked everyone for forgiveness, and then hugged his brother James, the eldest, and apologized to him again, and they hugged each other like when they were children. Elvin was finally among his loved ones, in his land, and he had discovered that everyone still loved him, and he understood even more the mistake he had made by abandoning them all years before. He found his bed and all his clothes that his mother had kept because she knew Elvin would return. He then asked for explanations of that strange behavior that everyone had when he arrived, and they explained everything to him. He reassured them by saying that King Edward I, who had invaded Ireland years before, had now concluded his military campaign, and there was no longer any danger of forced conscription or confiscation of livestock. There were only stationary troops to maintain the English presence and influence on the island, but that was all. That night, Elvin slept in his bed again and remembered the good days he had spent on the farm with his loved ones. He secretly cried with joy, but finally he was home and fell asleep. In the following days, Elvin began to feel like an important part of the clan again. And after a few days, as Christmas 1275 approached, he spoke to his mother and father, and also wanted his firstborn James. He said he had important things to say, but they had to swear that what he was about to say would never be said to anyone else in the clan or reported to strangers outside the clan, otherwise a great misfortune would befall the clan. Everyone looked at him in amazement and could not understand what he was about to say or do, or even why a misfortune. He then recounted that while he was in the Holy Land during a very bloody clash with the Mamluks after the battle, while he was wandering around the battlefield looking for any survivors, he came across a seriously wounded enemy officer but still alive, who at the time had been believed dead by his men. He took him and brought him to his camp where he had him treated, saving his life. His name was Muhammad bin al-Maktoum, and he was the son of the Emir of Damascus. His father was certainly mourning his death, and asked him to send a messenger to his father, bringing him a letter with a poem that only his father knew, as proof that he had survived. Elvin had accepted, and the messenger had left for Damascus with a safe conduct signed by Muhammad, and with the letter for his father. He returned a few days later telling of the enormous joy his father had felt, and also brought with him a sealed box, which contained a kind of dagger, but which had no blade inside the sheath. It was made of gold, not bulky, covered with stones, perhaps precious, that lit up when used, and this was the gift that Muhammad had asked his father for himself. It was not a dagger like many others, but Muhammad explained to him that his family called it the Dagger of Allah. That strange object had supernatural powers. It had belonged to his family for generations and had been given to his ancestors by people who, it is said, came from the stars, and he wanted Elvin to be his friend, as well as the owner of the object. When he was still a boy, he had heard his father and his brothers talk about mysterious visitors who had arrived in a huge flying ship. who had stopped in the desert near his family's tents many years before. His ancestors had been very surprised, but not knowing anything, they had welcomed them as gods and had fed them with what they had. The visitors, surprised by such kindness, after eating, saw that in the tent, on a bed, there was a sick person, a woman visibly in precarious health conditions, and asked to be able to cure her. They took out from a pocket what his family now called the Dagger of Allah, and pointed it at the woman who was suffering from a very strong cough, and in a few minutes she healed. She was one of the wives of his ancestors, and after a few minutes, inexplicably, she began to rejuvenate. A supernatural event, they thought. Faced with the wonder and amazement of his ancestors, they decided to give them the Dagger of Allah, explaining well how to use it. From generation to generation it had come down to him, who out of gratitude wanted to give him this great gift. Elvin had accepted, and Muhammad explained to him how he could use the supernatural powers of that object. He took it in his hands and squeezed it tightly, then told the object that he would soon hand over command to another master called Elvin Kelly, and that it should serve him as he had done with him. The strange object lit up, one of the stones emitted a green light and then went out. Muhammad placed it in Elvin's hands and told him to tell the object that he had accepted ownership, that he was now the master and that obedience was owed to him. Elvin followed the instructions, and the Dagger of Allah lit up again with a green light and then went out. The power had been transferred to Elvin. Muhammad continued with his explanations and confided to him that the power consisted of curing any disease and helping the master to become richer and richer, and with the change of each generation, the next generation would double his assets. Every asset owned would double in a short time, but only if 3 conditions were met. The first was that no one outside the family should know about these powers, or everything that had been gained would be lost in a very short time. The second was that in the future, only the firstborn males of the family would be able to touch and use that strange object and know about these powers. The third rule concerned the women of the house. If any of the women of the house, except the mother of the firstborn in turn, came to know about the supernatural powers and confided to another woman of the clan what she knew, the Dagger of Allah, as in the other 2 previous rules, would cease to function forever. In all 3 cases, a terrible misfortune would befall the family and all its blood relatives. Therefore, no one should talk to strangers or to his wife or sister about this instrument and its supernatural powers. Muhammad repeated it to him for safety. Only the firstborn and his parents could know about the Dagger of Allah, but only the firstborn could use it after him, no one else. The Dagger of Allah, with all its supernatural powers, could only be passed from firstborn to firstborn, basically from firstborn father to firstborn son. No one else could touch it or hold it. Since Elvin was in the Holy Land, he had not used it yet, but now that he was home, he was ready to give it to James, the firstborn, to show him his brotherly love and use it for the good of all. No one spoke. They were all thoughtful and surprised to hear this news. Then Elvin intervened and asked James if he was ready to accept his offer, to create prosperity for the entire clan and also for future generations. Otherwise, the power would end with Elvin's death, since he was not the firstborn. James said he wanted to think about it. The news he had given him was too surprising, and he did not know what to do. Elvin told him to stay calm and take all the time he needed. He was at home and wanted to stay there. They talked for a long time, clarified their positions, and all 4 hugged each other. Then Elvin, since he had learned that his father was not in great physical condition and suffered a lot from pain in all his bones, asked his father if he wanted to try that strange object. After all, it was the first time he had done it, and there was no danger. Without waiting for an answer, he took the Dagger of Allah in his hands, squeezed it tightly, and ordered that all pain be taken away from his father, who was watching him with the others in disbelief. The object lit up and emitted a strong beam of light that hit his father, who was scared to see that intense beam of blue light that was expanding and enveloped him for a few seconds. Then it went out without any noise. Elvin asked his father how he felt, and he told him that he felt a strange tingling that was spreading throughout his body, and after a few minutes it stopped. At the same time, his father got up from the chair, threw the stick on the ground, and stood up perfectly without any pain. His body also looked younger, and his white hair was changing color and slowly becoming blonde, like when he was much younger. They were all amazed and terrified and shouted witchcraft, but Elvin calmed them down and said that that was just one of the powers that strange object had. Elvin took the Dagger of Allah again and pointed it at his mother Mary and ordered her to heal all evils, and the instrument repeated the same procedure. After a few minutes, Mary was changing her appearance and was also getting younger, without any pain in her bones. Happily, she hugged her husband and immediately caressed her beloved Elvin. James was shocked to see his parents getting younger and immediately understood the enormous value of the gift that Elvin wanted to give him and hugged him tenderly, but with strength. In the days to come, James accepted the gift that Elvin had proposed to him, and the Kelly clan prospered without any more problems. Elvin slowly adapted to his new life, and it was a pleasure for him to return to the same life he had once had. He happily got up in the morning without the thought of having to fight against someone to save his skin. He talked to his brother and asked him if he could be a shepherd in the hills, since he had become accustomed to life in the open air. He did not want to be a burden to the family. James told him that he had a better job in mind for him. He would keep him close to him in the direction of the clan's work, as an equal. He loved his brother too much and did not want to lose him again, and he also knew that Elvin loved him, and the gift he had brought him from the Holy Land was proof of that. Elvin was astonished and amazed to hear this offer and hugged his brother James again. He could not believe that his brother wanted to give him such a welcome, but he accepted enthusiastically and said that he was ready immediately. In the months to come, Elvin was more and more often sent to follow the work of the farm, which was slowly but steadily growing. In the late spring of 1277, James had wanted him with him, when after a few months of negotiations he had gone to Belfast to conclude the deal for the purchase of new pastures to the west, where there were also some streams of fresh water to quench the cattle. James made him feel important when at the time of signing the final contract, he wanted Elvin to also put his signature next to his. Elvin was surprised but pleasantly moved, and before a tear unmasked him, he bent down, dipped his pen in the inkwell and slowly wrote his name on the parchment that hosted the contract, next to that of his brother. The days of the argument with his brother came back to him, and he remembered even more what his brother had said to him that day when he had refused him the loan to start a new business of his own. Now he understood why his brother had not been able to help him. He was saving money to expand the farm, and he wanted him by his side. What an idiot he had been, but only for a moment. He did not show the deep emotion he was feeling, and when he was finished, he hugged his brother and thanked the seller. James, who had brought the money, some coins, hidden under his clothes, untied the strings that kept them safe in a leather bag, tightly tied to his body, and poured them out on the table. Everyone was amazed. James was paying with gold pennies, which he had only heard of, and no one in those parts had ever seen them. The seller was also amazed and surprised because he was expecting the classic silver coins, which they had been talking about until that moment. James counted them, agreed on the exchange of coins that were accepted with enthusiasm, and paid for the lands, and now they were the new owners of 200 acres of fertile pastures that bordered their farm. To conclude the transaction, together with the seller, they took the contract to the Court of Chancery for the registration of the contract, and then finally, having completed the necessary paperwork, they were ready to return home to tell everyone else the good news. That evening, a party was held at the farm, and people danced until late, to the sound of rudimentary instruments, which on that occasion were better than the trumpets of the crown. As the years passed, the two brothers became more and more united in a deep brotherly love when the forced conscriptions began again. Edward II of England, also known as Edward Longshanks and Hammer of the Scots, was involved in several wars during the 1280s and found himself short of men. As he had done previously in the Irish campaign, he sent his janissaries out to recruit men to be forcibly conscripted. The rumors began to spread and reached the Kelly farm, who immediately set up lookouts as they had done about 5 years earlier, and put in place all defenses to avoid capture by these recruiting bands, composed of armed knights. The cattle were moved to underground stables, camouflaged among the Irish hills, and the men were kept away as a precaution. One afternoon in April in the year 1281, just after the spring thaw, the lookouts announced the arrival of 10 knights on the road to the farm. All the men present fled into the woods, while Elvin calmly had some women saddle his horse, rummaged through his things, and shortly after came out onto the porch fully armed with his armor, chainmail, sword, spear, and shield, in addition to his old crusader clothes. Calmly, without haste, he mounted his horse and headed towards the edge of the farmyard, where this, about 20 meters ahead, joined the road from which the 10 knights would arrive. He stood slightly sideways to make himself more visible, looking towards the bend over there, from where the road came out from behind the hill, and calmly waited for them. Shortly after, the 10 knights emerged from behind the bend at a light canter, and at the sight of that fully armed knight who did not promise anything good, they slowed down and continued at a walk, discussing among themselves. Who was he? Thus they came within greeting distance of the knight, and it was then that they saw his insignia and discovered his rank. He was an officer of the army who had participated in the last of the Crusades in the Holy Land, where he had fought the infidels and had managed to return home. They remained still and speechless. Then their commander dismounted from his horse and took 4 steps forward, while the others lined up in a semicircle in front of him and lowered their lances. He drew his sword and stuck it in the ground, and then, taking off his plumed hat, as was the custom at that time, he bent one leg behind him and bowed in great respect. Elvin bowed back with the conventional sign of the knights, and the commander apologized to him and told him that they did not know that there was such a great and brave knight on the farm who had fought for Jesus Christ. But now, everything was different. They apologized for what had happened and promised that no one would ever return to that holy place and would return on horseback. They left. James was the first to run and waited for Elvin to dismount and hugged him. That was how everyone found out that their beloved Elvin had become an important knight in the Holy Land and had been decorated several times for his courage and his valor. But Elvin had never told anything about his years in those places. The events that had happened had greatly revalued Elvin's image in the eyes of all his relatives who lived on the farm, and everyone looked at him and treated him with more respect. Even if Elvin made fun of himself and said that he was the same person as always and did not deserve all those honors, the situation remained the same, and in the end he got used to it. The new pastures had been a real bargain. The streams that ran through them made the land truly beautiful, and the animals that grazed there were beautiful, so the sheep provided longer wool that was easier to spin. The women who worked the looms produced wonderful fabrics that they couldn't explain, and they were forced to revolutionize their entire farm because all of Belfast wanted their fabrics. James, together with Elvin, decided to build a large building to install new looms to meet the growing demand. A year later, everything was ready, and the ordered looms had arrived after a party where they danced until the next morning. The looms were started, and the production of fabrics began. The business was going well, but the Kellys remained humble people, attached to their land and enthusiastic about the new production of fabrics. The fame of these wonderful fabrics reached as far as London, and one day a messenger on horseback carrying the insignia of the Crown of England arrived at the Kelly farm and delivered a letter from King Edward I, with which he summoned one or more representatives of the Kelly family to London to have a sample of fabrics for his clothes. He had left a ship at their disposal in the port of Belfast, ready to sail to London. James and Elvin were very surprised by this notoriety up to London and by this request from the Crown. They discussed it between the two of them, and then James decided that Elvin would leave for London with the fabric samples for the king's clothes. James would stay at the farm to conduct business. Elvin did not expect this new demonstration of trust and hugged his brother, and together they prepared a series of fabric samples to show to his serene majesty. 2 days later, Elvin sailed from Belfast to London, where he would arrive 3 days later. He had brought with him more than 100 special fabrics in pure wool for the king's clothes. The arrival in London was again emotional for Elvin, in the same port where he had arrived about 10 years earlier, on a ship from the Holy Land. Instinctively, he felt almost identical emotions and was pleasantly moved. They landed in London in the late morning, and he was immediately taken to the Tower of London, the castle built about 200 years earlier by William I, called the Conqueror, the current seat of the court of Edward I. Elvin was admitted with all his collection to the presence of the king, and here an extraordinary thing happened. When King Edward I saw him, his expression changed. He looked at him several times and then said, "I believe that we two know each other." but I have never had the honor of thanking you since you saved my life in the Holy Land when I was attacked by some assassins sent to kill me by Baybars, the Sultan at the head of the Mamluks." Elvin, who had knelt before his king, replied, "Yes, your majesty, I am that man," and told some details that only those who had lived them could know. At these words, Edward I jumped up and went to Elvin and lifted him up, to the amazement of the court and the murmurs of the envious. When Elvin was back on his feet, the king, turning to everyone, said, "This man, whom I have searched for years, to please him but never found, was brought to me by fate, by chance, and I, Edward I, King of England, before all of you want to express to him, from the bottom of my heart, my thanks. Honor him as if he were my own person." Everyone bowed and knelt before Elvin and their king. Elvin was tempted to kneel down in turn, but the king held him firm and standing beside him, and then he added, "Never in my life have I had the opportunity to see the extreme courage of a man who fought for my salvation and defeated 10 Mamluk warriors armed with everything. Without his courage and determination to save me, my life would have ended long ago." Having said this, he hugged him and thanked him again. Then he made him sit next to him, and they talked about when they were in the Holy Land and what had happened to him all those years. Edward was very attentive to Elvin's story and relived with him the tribulations he had suffered during that time. Then, immediately he stood up and decided to make him a Knight of the Crown. He had Elvin get ready, all stunned and touching him with the sword on his shoulders. While Elvin remained kneeling before him, he made him a Knight of the Crown and Count Palatine. He then gave instructions that the Kelly family be included among the official suppliers of the crown. In private, the king wanted to personally see the samples of the fabrics, which were so much talked about in London, and which Elvin had brought him, and was impressed by the great quality and choice of textures for the colors. He immediately gave orders to prepare the necessary funds for the advance payment of a year's supply, leaving the Kelly family free to choose the fabrics because they were all wonderful, and he did not know which to choose.